Now I'd like to introduce the host of our panel, Lisa Gar. And Lisa, Yogananda said that there are 4 aspects of consciousness: the mind, the intellect, the ego, and feeling. And Lisa has dedicated her life to that feeling aspect of consciousness, to awareness, to an expanding sense of reality, and to getting to know people in the heart. And I'm so grateful that you could join us this evening, Lisa, and to facilitate our panel. Let's give her a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. Are you having an amazing evening of learning, of experience, of connection, of warmth? Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. I am deeply honored to be able to host this panel of amazing experts and people who have brought the work of exactly the message of Yogananda to bring joy to the heart into the world. And this incredible panel of beautiful people, as well as experts in their fields and bright shining lights in the world, are here to share with us how they have utilized the message of Paramhansa Yogananda in their work and how his work has impacted what their work is in the world. So I have the true joy and pleasure to introduce this amazing panel and to have a dialogue, to have their experiences brought forth in this conversation, and also to bring forth your questions through the Ask the Question period of tonight as well. So I want to bring up the rest of the panel, and I'm going to ask them to have a seat next to me here. Philip Goldberg is here, and I'm going to have Philip come up and have a seat, and I'm going to introduce each one of our wonderful guests. He's the co-host of Spirit Matters podcast, and he leads American Veda tours, and this is based on his best-selling book, American Veda. He blogs regularly on Huffington Post and spirituality and health, and he is well-versed in Yogananda's influence in bringing meditation to the West. He's actually currently working on the biography of Paramhansa Yogananda and his life, and he's working on that book, which will be brought into the world by Hay House very, very soon. So he is here to share with us the deep historical content of Yogananda's work in the world. So let's give Philip Goldberg a wonderful round of applause. And please come to the stage, Yogi Cameron. And Yogi Cameron, after years in the fashion industry, appearing with celebrities like Madonna and modeling for Versace and Guess, Yogi Cameron sought out inner beauty as well as outer beauty. And he found himself going on an amazing journey to India, studying meditation and Ayurveda, and the wonderful life that came from that work emerged in his inner sense of beauty that he shares now with the world through his work. So it's a wonderful pleasure to have Yogi Cameron here. And joining us next is the wonderful Reverend Michael Beckwith. And he is the founder of Agape International Spiritual Center, a global New Thought community, quite a pioneer. He's the co-chair of the Season for Nonviolence, and also one of the featured teachers of The Secret. And my experience with Michael Beckwith is his incredible ability to divinely channel the divine and to bring messages, palpitating messages of the divine through your being into our world. So it's a great pleasure to have Michael Beckwith here. And Narayan, who has been our wonderful host all evening, is joining us on the panel as well. Narayan Romano. Yes. And just to share a little bit of Narayan's humble story, he had discovered Autobiography of a Yogi when he was in New York. And he was inspired then to learn Kriya Yoga and to share the teachings of self-realization. And then he became the founding member of Ananda in New York City and then here in California, and now is the spiritual director of Ananda Los Angeles. So he has done an amazing job in facilitating this evening and making this evening flow so beautifully for all of us. So welcome. Thank you. So I'm going to propose a question to each one of our panelists and allow them to contribute their passion for Yogananda's work and how it's influenced their life.
Well, the first time I read Autobiography of Yogi, or I got a copy of it when I was 19, and I never read it. And then I gave it away. And then it reappeared again, I don't know how, and I gave that one away. And I had about had about 3 or 4 or 5 of these books keep following me around. So eventually, when I went to India for the first time about 15 years ago, I took it with me. And that's when it had a profound effect, because I was studying Ayurvedic medicine, I was going on the path, I had a guru, and I suddenly had decided, I want to live as a yogi, I don't want to just teach this to people. And in reading the passages and all the difficulties that Yogananda went through, because I came from the world of fashion, life was easy, it was great, you know, I just traveled, met people, showed up in a studio, took a few photos, made some money, and then traveled some more, and you know, life wasn't so deep. So when I went to India, I was thinking, yeah, life is pretty easy, you know, it's all good. And when I got there and saw the depth of the teachings, I knew I was in trouble, because I was like, God, the divine, has given me a free ride for about 12 years in the fashion business, and it's time to work. And that's been the last, I don't know, 20 years, 21 years or whatever it's been. It's a lot of work. And I appreciated what Yogananda would say. He was going through so many struggles. And here's Avatar going through struggles, right? And at times I would say, why is it so difficult? You know, why is spiritual life? And my guru had said the same thing. He said, don't think you're going to go on a spiritual life. It's all going to be great, like you were in the fashion business, you know. So, you know, and I thought, oh, it can't be that bad. But it got so bad at times. I mean, I was like, wow, you know, I really want to go somewhere else and do something else. This is hard. So when I read Yogananda going through it, I was like, okay, I can do this as well. Not at that level, but I can do something here, and I can stop complaining as well. That will help. So I got into it, and you know, the inspiration, as everybody has sort of shared, is the depth of that book. You know, the reason it's still with us is the storytelling of a saint's life or an avatar's life. It really uplifts you. You know, you can just flip in any page, open it up, and you read a story. And each chapter's, you know, maybe 12 pages, something like that. And just coming here and all the journeys in India, you know. And when I was in India with my guru, and I was, you know, I wanted to stay there at some point. I finished training, and he said, yeah, you should go to the West now and start teaching people. I think it had been about 6 or 7 years. And I was like, no, I'll stay in India, it's great, you know. And he said, well, what are you going to do here? And I said, I don't know, meditate. It's going to be great. And he said, well, that's going to be a waste of time, because I'm here, we don't really need you here. So I hadn't really thought it out, right? When you talk to Guru, you better think it out first, because he already knows what you're thinking, you know, 12 days before. So you're at a vast disadvantage. So I sort of thought, okay, I guess he's right. I better go back. And in truth, I was a little bit apprehensive and fearful, because I said, you know, I used to do something completely different, and I'm going to go, and I'm an ex-model, and I'm going to go into that spiritual world and teach Ayurvedic medicine. This stuff's deep. And who's going to believe me, you know? Who's going to, so, you know, and I'd been away about 10 years out of the fashion business and training and all that, but it was just sounded far-fetched, you know. model and now spiritual leader and all that kind of stuff. So Yogananda's book, reading it and picking it up, and it kind of reiterated, it doesn't matter who you are, where you came from, where you're going, don't worry, it's all good. You're only using this body as transportation, right? It's just the covering. It's just covering your soul. And make that real, and then live by that law, you know. So that's really the depth of this book.
Thank you. And for bringing a modern context to the teachings of Yogananda. Philip Goldberg has learned the historical context of the work of Yogananda, of course, through writing the biography now of his work. How do you feel that this work will impact us 50 years from now?
I'm much better at the past than the future. So.
You're the perfect person to answer this then.
And that, now that I know that being a fashion model is easy, I may just go into that field instead of writing books.
I'll be your agent.
That's the deal. Let me begin with the past and bring it forward. Yogananda, in my research for American Veda, I covered 200 years of these teachings coming to us and bringing us to this moment in history of where yoga is everywhere and meditation is everywhere, and where the spiritual fabric of America has been radically transformed by these teachings that came to us from India. In that context, there have been many gurus who came here, and I studied all their lives. But only very few, 3 really, had huge, massive global impact. And Yogananda was one of them, and probably one could argue the most influential. And there were sort of 2 phases of that. He was the first guru to come from India and settle in America. He spent more than half his life here, most of his adult life. So from 1920 till his passing in 1952, he was the guru of America. The LA Times called him the first superstar guru of the 20th century. All the gurus who got big and famous in the late 60s and 70s, when some of us remember gurus being everywhere, in the aftermath especially of the Beatles going to India and opening the floodgates. They were building on Yogananda's work because he had set the template and did the groundwork that created essentially what was necessary for the other gurus to succeed. And in all, to be historically honest, Swami Vivekananda, who preceded Yogananda in the 1890s and grew up, you should know, his house where he grew up in Calcutta, you can walk to where Yogananda spent his teenage years. So, and he was a big influence on Yogananda when he was growing up. And he set groundwork that made Yogananda's work possible or easier. So all these teachers fed on one another, and there were 2 phases. There was this phase where Yogananda was a living master and the most popular guru and most famous guru in the country or in the West. And then the autobiography succeeded him and kept him as a real presence ever since 1946, well, ever since his passing in 1952. And so in the late 60s and 70s, when there was this explosion of interest in Indian spirituality and yoga and meditation, that book was a door opener for millions and millions of people. in the one of the videos, you heard me say that I interviewed more than 300 people for American Veda, and when I asked them what got them on their spiritual path, if they mentioned a book, far and away, it was more likely to be Autobiography of a Yogi. Just as a side note, the second most often mentioned was Ram Dass's Be Here Now. But Ram Dass mentioned Autobiography of a Yogi when I interviewed him. So, and there were two kinds of people. There were many, many people who came upon the autobiography because, books were circulating and people would give this to each other. And that was their introduction to yogic teachings and Indian philosophy, and it set them on their path. And many of them became devotees of Yogananda, but many found their way to other teachings and other gurus, whatever suited them. Then there was another category of people who were already on their spiritual path. I was one of those. When I first borrowed a copy of the autobiography, which I still have, it was 1969 or 70, and I had already become enamored of yogic teachings and the legacy of Hinduism and Buddhism. And I had read a tremendous amount. I had read Vivekananda's books. I had read the Upanishads. I had read the Gita. I was reading Alan Watts and all these people. And then there was another book, and it looked interesting. It was really thick. It was a hardcover, and the price tag was $5. And I know I didn't have $5 in those days, so I know I borrowed it. And I still have that copy. All these years later, all the moving around I've done, I was living in the Boston area at the time, and I still have that copy. And I'm working off the karma of never returning it by talking about it publicly now. So in my case, the autobiography added to what I knew and what I felt and what I was exploring in ways that no other book could or did. Now, one thing you should understand, in India, the genre of biography and autobiography is pretty much non-existent until modern years. So for a yogi, for a spiritual master, for a swami, a renunciate, to write a memoir was very, very rare, if anything. So the personal nature of it is one of the reasons it resonates so much with people, and it did with me. There's information. It solidified a lot of things I'd read. It said things in a way that I hadn't heard before. But there were the stories of the yogis, the stories of the miracle workers. And I've always found there were two kinds of people who love the autobiography because of the miracles, and people who love the autobiography in spite of the miracle. Because they don't believe them, but they love the book anyway for everything else. And I was somewhere in the middle. I was intrigued by the miracles, but it was his personal story that made the spiritual quest and the promise of higher consciousness somehow more real, because here was somebody who had a childhood and experienced the death of a mother at a young age, which I had also, and yet look what he became. And so there were these kinds of people, and to this day, there are still those people discovering something new in the autobiography that they hadn't heard before, or getting started on their spiritual path. And I was asked about 50 years from now, and I don't make predictions, but it's inconceivable to me that 50 years from now, the autobiography will be forgotten, or that it will no longer continue to have an impact. Because there's a vast body of spiritual literature out here, and thanks to the Bodhitree, by the way, We're all familiar with so much of that now, and now everything's available at our fingertips. But there's only one autobiography of a yogi. There's a lot of spiritual memoirs now, but it stands out, and it will stand the test of time. And one of Yogananda's gifts, I think, was not just his teaching and his writing and his public speaking, but he had a certain organizational skill. He surrounded himself with people that he prepared to carry his teachings forward, and those people have done a very good job. These teachings live partly because of them and partly because of the autobiography, and that combination, through events like this and the work of all the people involved, will keep that book in the forefront, I'm sure, long into the future.
Thank you very much. And Reverend Michael Beckwith, could you share with us how Yogananda's work has influenced your path in the world?
The word that comes, hello.
Teamwork.
The word that comes to me is sanity. A number of years ago, I had a spiritual awakening, but there was no reference point to it. I was somewhat agnostic, probably, maybe even atheistic at the time. As a matter of fact, when I was attending Morehouse College, I had the record of converting Christians to atheism. And so fast forward, I moved back to Los Angeles, and I was a part of a group in which we wanted to change the world by any means necessary. And I remember sitting in this room, and a voice said, if we were to take over the world tomorrow, would it be any different? So I turned around to see who said this, and there was no one there. So I heard it again, if we were to take over the world tomorrow, would it be any different? So I looked around the room, and I saw the people I was in conversation with, and I could see territorialism and egocentric behavior and aggressiveness and greed, and I said, wow, the world wouldn't be any different. So I left that meeting, never to go back. The week after that, someone shot someone in that meeting, but I wasn't there because I had heard this voice. But I didn't have anything to replace that with. There was no epiphany at that time other than I left that. So I enrolled in USC. I was a psychobiology major, and I began to have a series of inner experiences and that I didn't have any reference point with. At that time, this was called pathology. Astral traveling and having visions and hearing voices. So I immediately stopped smoking weed. But they increased. These particular experiences increased. And then culminated with a death in which when I woke from it, I could see that we were surrounded by a presence of light and love and beauty and intelligence, permeates everything. Animate and inanimate objects glow and shine with this presence that's never an absence. And so I could see this, and I still didn't have a reference point, but I knew I was different. And so I began to research what had happened to me. Still thought maybe I was a little crazy. And so 3 of the people that gave me sanity, one, of course, was Paramhansa Yogananda, the autobiography of a yogi. In reading that, it gave me a context of the things that I was going through and growing through. The greatest mystic that came out of America was Walter Russell. And so the Divine Iliad, and he went into states of cosmic consciousness and wrote prolifically. That assisted me. And then through Wilson Van Dusen, The Natural Depth in Man, I began to study Emanuel Swedenborg. But the initial hit from the autobiography of a yogi gave me a reference point to what was happening. And then there were this years of practice. I used to go to the center on Sunset, took the classes, meditated, and I started hearing the chants tonight my past came flooding back into me, you know, and it's just been a process of a number of years of insight and integration into that expanded awareness that and integrating into my daily life. And so the awareness of cosmic consciousness, the awareness of unity, the awareness of love, the awareness that each of us are individualized expressions of this dynamic one life of infinite intelligence and divine love and perfect peace, which is loaded and coded within his writings. And, as everyone has kind of mentioned, it's not abstract, it's not theoretical, it's not a hypothesis. When you pick up the book, you can feel that he knew and knows. And even today, if I go out and I'm a part of a program, I can listen to people and I can tell in a few minutes whether they know about it or whether they know it. And so Paramhansa Yogananda is a true avatar. And those initial hits gave me sanity, let me know I wasn't crazy, and then made me completely dedicated to a spiritual practice of which today I still have the same fire that I had 40 years ago, same commitment. In my mind, I'm a beginner, perennial student. I don't know anything except when I'm about to talk, and then something happens. So I'll stop there. It was a great influence on my life. Beautiful. And continues to be.
Yes,
yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. Narayan, I would love to ask you why you feel that the book, the autobiography of a yogi really gets into people's hearts, into their souls. Why do you think it permeates? Why do you think it takes on a life of its own?
May I answer that by telling you a story?
Yes.
About 30 years ago, Swami Kriyananda was actually speaking at the old Bodhitree location down here on Melrose. And I'm sure many of you remember that incarnation of the Bodhitree had all these pictures of saints and gurus on the wall. And there was a man in the audience, unbeknownst to Swamiji, that was praying for a sign, if a certain saint was his guru or not. And this man was just having this inward prayer going. And Swamiji, right at that time, said, when you're ready, you don't have to go around the world to find your guru. When the disciple is ready, the guru will come to you. And right at that moment, a photograph fell off the wall and into the lap of this man who was praying for a sign. It wasn't Paramhansa Yogananda, it was another guru, and it was his confirmation. That's who he thought was his guru. So this is what the Bodhitree is about. Ask the question. You know, the very first sentence of Autobiography of a Yogi, the characteristic features of Indian culture have long been the search for ultimate verities, truth, and the concomitant, which means it naturally goes with it, disciple-guru relationship. And on a personal note, why I think it gets in there, I think it's the response to our soul call. You know, Babaji, the great Mahavatar Babaji that Yogananda talks about in Autobiography, said to Swami Sri Yukteswar when Sri Yukteswar met him at the Kumbh Mela, that I feel the vibrations from potential saints in America, in Europe, coming flood-like to me. Can you imagine that? Well, who was he talking about? He was talking about you. And I'll just share one other brief story, how I seemingly stumbled upon this book and how it changed my life. I used to work in New York City in the financial markets, so it was, you know, Wall Street, and very intense and hectic and stressful, and I was utterly desperate. I would highlight in bold and italicize, desperate for peace. I wanted God, I wanted something more. I didn't know what to call it, but I knew I wanted something. And I was on a sales trip in the Midwest, actually at a used bookstore, very much like the Bodhitree. And I asked the question. Actually, I demanded the answer. Yogananda's book, Whispers from Eternity, he called those prayer demands. Like Christ said, pray believing. You go through that book and you know that he knew it and that he was making bombshell after bombshell. He used to say that you must break the ramparts of God's silence with your own concentrated silence. And so I stumbled into this bookstore, into the metaphysical section, and I said mentally, I remember looking up, like it says in the Bible, I will lift up my eyes unto the hills, and my help cometh from the Lord. And I just looked up, and mentally I said, I need a good book. You must send me a good book now. And I pulled this book off the shelf, and I looked into Yogananda's eyes, and I knew it was an answer to my prayer. And Master said that when you're a little serious, God sends you books. When you get a little bit more serious, he sends you teachers. But when you're very earnest in your quest for God, he sends you the guru. I was lucky enough that he sent me all three at once.
Thank you so much for sharing that beautiful story. And so I would like to continue to ask questions that came from the audience, the ask the question part of this, because it brings relevance into the room to pull in the current topic, the topic that is on so many people's minds, and bring the ancient teachings of Yogananda to a very current political topic that we are in right now, is the uncertainty that is moving about our country right now and the world. And not only political uncertainty, but uncertainty in so many people's minds. So I invite whoever's called to answer this question is, how does Yogananda's teachings apply to our current global uncertainty? Michael? Yes.
You saw me reaching for the mic, or you?
I saw it.
Or did you think I was reaching for the mic and that made me reach for the mic? I don't know. What came first? When we consider the teachings of unity and oneness and love, not as an abstract concept, but as ultimate realities, love being the total givingness of the presence without any sense of withhold, peace being the dynamic of harmonizing good, unity, we're all one. As we're doing this kind of work, meditation, affirmative prayer, introspection, and we become initiated at higher and higher levels of consciousness, we're called to be what I have called recently the spiritual first responders. Meaning when you look at a first responder, EMT, or fire person, they're trained. So when they arrive on a scene, the fire, house is burning down, a man's leg is broken, they don't go crazy. Oh my God, the house is burning down. What are we going to do? The man's leg is broken. Though they have such a level of training that they're able to hold the space, put out the fire, fix the man's leg, whatever the case may be, they don't deny that the house is burning. They don't deny that there's injury and disappointment and hurt. But they have a level of training that allows them to actually do what is necessary. So when we look at the work of Paramhansa Yogananda and the inner work we have to do, we go through, I like to say there's at least three worlds that we live in. The first world is the world of effects. It's the world of mass distraction produced by the corporate media. It's the fear, the doubt, the worry, the separation, the bigotry, the homophobia, the hate, sense of separation, scarcity. That's running amok in the world of individuals' experience. But as we do our work, we're able to see that world differently. And we're able to see opportunities, possibilities, potential, and we're able to see our particular assignments as first responders. What are we called to do? What conversations are we called to have? What is our action to be in the world based on what we begin to see as opportunities without denying tremendous disappointment, without denying negativity, without denying the things that have risen, what are we called to do? And as we continue to do our inner work, we see the third world, which I was blessed to see many times, which is the world that God sees. That in saint and sinner, there's a life and a beauty and a love and a harmony and an intelligence that's untouched by time and experience. And we ask ourselves, as we're about to do anything, what world am I representing? And so then our actions come from that higher world. And we fall, we stumble. We're not always able to do that, but we have work to do. And so I would say that we're called to be first responders. I recently invited the congregation at Agape, and I got a groan from it at first, to place the picture of Donald Trump on their altar, and to see if they could really garner a tremendous amount of God love for this gentleman, this man, who has, go down that road. Let's keep it high. But if someone is not going to see God within him, who will? If we can't, who can? If someone's not going to see that God made him and that there's love, intelligence, and beauty there, who's going to see it? So we're called to live at that level, while at the same time asking, what is my assignment in the world at this time? What am I called to do? And so then that, in the Sufi teachings, there's a saying that talks about the fact when there's great disappointment, the master says, this is going to be an exciting time. And so with great disappointment, we're called to understand that we're in exciting times. Lethargy, apathy goes out the window. And can you imagine the last 8 years when our president was being slapped around by the Congress? No one was out in the streets protesting. No one was doing anything. But suddenly, this misogynist becomes elected, and people are out speaking again and talking. What are we going to do? And so he's an evolutionary trigger that's allowing us to go higher. So I know there's a lot in what I said.
Yes, serves a purpose of awakening.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much.
I should know better than to follow Michael on the topic, but I'm so thrilled that he made a point of addressing the need for action, because the last 3 weeks I am getting really tired of getting emails from my spiritual friends that amount to escapism and spiritual pablum. And it's all well and good. We all need to take care of our inner lives. That's why we're here, and we all know that, and that's why we're working. But in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna doesn't just tell Arjuna to be a yogi. He says, establish yourself in yoga and then do your duty, perform action. And that is critical. And this is one of those moments. I love that term, spiritual first responders. But to bring it back to Yogananda, I'm looking at his life because I'm working on this biography, and it's important to realize the years he was here were incredibly difficult years in the history of America. He came in 1920, it was the roaring 20s, and there was an economic boom and all this exploration going on, and then the crash. And he was here through the Great Depression. And they were having trouble paying the mortgage on Mount Washington, and he was having tremendous difficulties. Everything had to change. And then World War II, and he was teaching through World War II and then the post-war era before he passed. Those were incredibly difficult years, that make our time, crazy as it is, it's not as difficult as going through the Depression and World War II. He kept his eye on the ball, his eye on the prize. He was teaching and writing and running an organization through thick and thin. And one of the things that's so admirable, and one of the reasons he's drawn so much love from so many people, is he was living a very human life. as this realized being, and went through very real struggles. And at one point, and he always wanted to go off back into the Himalayas and give it all up, but he never did. You know, he never could. He was always pulled back into, and so many of us have had that same feelings. Like, I don't want to live in a world where Donald Trump's my president. I'm going off to an ashram. Well, on the other hand, maybe I can do something. Maybe I can contribute. And so he's, in a sense, a role model for that yogic ideal of being in the world but not of the world, and being attentive to one's inner life but doing what needs to be done in the world. He was writing about world affairs. Obviously, his calling was different from ours, or, you know, he had his own calling. But in his writing, in the magazine that was coming out regularly, he was addressing the Depression and World War II and the build-up to it. He had things to say, and he said them. And we're called, that's a good role model, I think, for us at this time.
Yes, thank you. And if Yogananda's work is truly about a vision for unity, that is really the true practice that we can all use right now in bringing that vision of unity forth, no matter what political perspective you have or your neighbors or friends have. To hold that intention for the vision of unity is what we as a spiritual community in the West are responsible for. So that is how his work permeates still today and is still relevant today. One last question, and thank you for addressing that. So this is the 70th anniversary of this wonderful book and Yogananda's work. Darian, I'm going to ask you, how would you bring this book to our youth today and those who are seeking a quick solution? Do you understand?
I don't know of any quick solution. We need to be the change we want to see in the world. Yes, you know, you, like the Beatles said, you say you want a revolution. Well, this is the revolution. It's happening right within our own self. And the message of Kriya Yoga that Paramhansa Yogananda brought, like Phil was sharing, he was a great ambassador of being in the world but not touched by it. And in fact, that's what his name means. Paramhansa is the supreme swan. It's that image of one that glides through life. It's like duck skin, you know, just things just roll right off and they don't touch you. And so the practical teaching of Kriya Yoga, to teach meditation to our children. And this is the science of intercommunion. It's how the soul, if we are a soul, it's how the soul descended into the body, and it's how to work our way back out scientifically. And if we can saturate ourselves with God's presence and live God and live in God and share that with our children, that vibration will change them. And then we'll be inspired to be the spiritual bodyguard to take up whatever is needed. But we must seek God first. Because, you know, this world goes through these changes. It goes up and down all the time. And it's going to be like that. And it's our prod to go within and then to serve. You know, the first, it's like Christ said, what is the highest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. But in order to love your neighbor as yourself, in order to actually, you have to have a sense of that he is yourself. You have to expand into your neighbor in that way. And that is where the science of Kriya and intercommunion happens. And then we can ground it into reality for our children and for the whole world through spiritual community, like a spiritual community that the Bodhitree is, that Ananda, that Swami Kriyananda dedicated his life to being a community that is a real light in this world. So I would say, don't read Autobiography of a Yogi, receive it.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And one final question for Yogi Cameron. I wanted to ask you about Kriya Yoga and how you mentioned on my radio show, it's about cleansing.
Kriya means cleansing, but there's a lot more to it. I would say, Yogananda spoke about spiritual practice. So everything we're talking about, everything in that book, so you read it, you receive it, and you practice it. Because without the practice, Yogananda himself said, like we heard before, if we don't experience, and that experience comes from daily spiritual practice. So you get up in the morning, if you just get up in the morning and get on, pick up your phone, go have a coffee, why are you smiling? You really? He's like, that's me. It's a lot of us. If you don't dedicate, right, the first thing you do in the morning, what are you doing? What are you dedicating to? So for you to understand what the self is and to recognize yourself and your neighbor as yourself, you need a practice. You need something to ground you and give you that foundation. That comes from spiritual practice. So it's your dedication, right? You're creating your own, you're perceiving the world the way you're living, right? That's something else we saw before. And that's what Yogananda taught. Do your spiritual practice early in the morning if possible, then the rest of the day will be a reflection of that practice. So that's really what Kriya Yoga is. That's what all yoga is. That's what all yogic paths are. So whether you're following Kriya, Jnana, Bhakti, it doesn't matter. It's all the same. All the yogas are united. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much to our amazing panel. And I want to say thank you to the Bodhitree for facilitating this amazing evening, and Ananda worldwide, thank you so much for facilitating this amazing evening.